Hi guys, welcome to Design Technology TV. Today we're going to be looking at sustainability and we're going to be talking around issues associated with sustainability and a piece of written work which is a research project as much as anything for students to undertake with some background as to why sustainability is important. So first of all, sustain. What we actually mean by sustainability and what it actually means to us and the planet. First of all, it's able to support, hold, and bear the weight of, as in we are able, the planet itself is able to bear the weight of the pressures we put upon it, to bear the burden and charge, so to be able to take on those issues that we do, endure without giving way or yielding, so the planet basically being able to survive, to keep up or keep going, to sustain our lives. So sustainability is something that's based around the fact that if we don't consider sustainability, then we run some real issues. Why is sustainability important? First of all, it impacts the way that we live. So when we undertake consideration of sustainability, what we're doing is we're making sure that we are hopefully getting the best out of it. But unfortunately, sustainability is often a low priority, often due to economic concerns or political agendas. And what we find is that sustainability isn't always something that is high on the agenda, and it does impact the quality of our lives. At the moment, we are consistently going through a trend of global warming. You'll see some data to that effect through this presentation. That obviously affects our lives in many ways, and we'll talk about that in more detail as we go. It also affects biodiversity. Biodiversity is the range of creatures and organisms that are on the planet. As the temperature changes, various different animals and microorganisms will struggle to survive in new and challenging and changing conditions, and as such, that affects the number of animals on the planet. And ultimately, sustainability is affecting our long-term future as a species. If we don't start making radical changes to the way that we live and the things that we do run the risk of becoming extinct. Currently, we're seeing things such as weather events, temperature change, and pandemics, which are all down to the fact that sustainability isn't necessarily considered in detail. Weather events are probably the ones that we see more often. We're noticing in the UK some real trends and patterns in terms of changes of weather system. It used to be that August was a balmy summer month, that we always had really good weather and it was absolutely lovely. Now what we find is quite often April, May time tends to be really balmy and sunny and hot. And then when we get to August, we have a considerable amount of wet weather and rain, and the temperatures are not as high as they used to be. However, as an average, the temperature quite often is higher. Temperature change across the planet, and we'll see some talks of that, and also pandemics and other aspects, which are where our erosion and closer proximity to wild environments and wild species brings us into closer contact with diseases and viruses which we would not be in contact with otherwise. So eating animals that are not normally in our food chain, eating or cooking or working alongside animals which have similar DNA to us. So, for instance, tigers have 90% DNA the same as us, which is why recently there's been accounts of animals, including cats and big cats like tigers, suffering from COVID-19 or being able to carry it as well. So we are not as genetically different to other animals around us, and as such, we can share the same issues and the same viruses and diseases. So sustainability is becoming more prevalent as we go through. Sadly, due to certain global leaders, so Trump, for instance, at the moment has an agenda which has no focus on environmental issues. All he wants to do is make money. Equally, we have other countries around the globe who are up and coming, China, India, and various other places, who want their share of the pie and they want to make money. As such, they don't think it's fair that they take into account previous issues associating sustainability and environmental impacts, such as greenhouse gases. They think it's sort of the old industrial countries like the UK, Russia, etc., that should take responsibility for those. The problem is that we all live on this planet. We don't have a lot of choice in terms of what's happening now. And should those countries choose not to consider their actions at this stage, particularly seeing as they are becoming real global players in terms of the sizes of their economies, the amount of greenhouse gases they put out, and the number of people that live in their countries, we are running the risk of having some real issues associated with climate and temperature change. So here we've got some global temperature change between 1850 and 2016. You'll notice that it starts off in the middle. Um, the scientists have said that 1.5 degrees C is major change in the lifestyle and the way that we live. And you'll notice that as this graph progresses, this data shows that the average temperature is getting closer and closer to 1.5 degrees C. We are in real issues of breaching that. And what you'll see as we go through this presentation and some of the possible opportunities and one of the potential opportunity for us to break 1.5, maybe even 2 degrees C, and then see what difference that makes for us. There's some details on the right hand side here which talk about some of the key aspects which affect some of this warming. There are some people who are climate deniers who say that things like solar flares and other aspects affect our temperature globally, which is true. However, the trend, as we can see from this, is quite clearly that if you line this up against the actions of the human race and our industrialization, this mimics very closely the amount of greenhouse gases that we are putting into the environment. So, in a recent IPCC report, they looked at global warming and the effects of 1.5 degrees C. It's been noted that we need immediate transformation. So not in a few years' time, but immediate. And we are pushing towards needing a low carbon system. If we don't meet 1.5 degrees, there's real risks associated at 1.5 degrees and then even more at 2 degrees, which doesn't sound very much globally, but the difference that makes on the planet we live on and the environments that we live within. The human species is a very good adaptable species and we are capable of living everywhere. However, the plants, animals and the environments around us aren't necessarily as good at adapting and not as easily adaptable in a short space of time. So they don't have the technology to cool themselves down or to make clothes to wear to keep themselves warmer. They don't have the ability to remove themselves from flooding situations, fire situations, etc., as easily as we do, and as such, they tend to die rather than adapt. So the IPCC looks at the fact that we need to reduce emissions about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, and ideally net zero by the mid-century. There's people that looked at this report and said even this isn't as far-reaching as it needs to be to stop us from reaching either 1.5 or 2 degrees, but this is a major report about it. They're also looking at removing carbon from the system. There's a variety of companies who are looking into carbon removal systems, so trying to capture carbon and then to put it elsewhere. The data shows us that our investment in the carbon technologies now will actually save business huge amounts of money down the line, but unfortunately government does not follow that. One of the issues we have globally are either dictators who have self profits, that they want to make money for themselves in terms of their own profits, or they have their own agendas. We also then have systems in a number of countries, including our own, where we have short-term governments of either 4 or 5 years. The problem with climate change generally and environmental issues are they are longer reaching and they're expensive. So to put them in place means that a government is going to have to say we're going to put a significant sum of money into doing X. The problem with that is that then that affects their ability to put money into other sections of our communities and other sections of our lives. And unfortunately, often voters vote for the things that are the nice shiny things that they can see immediately coming into their pockets or being benefits, and they then don't vote for the environmental issues. The other thing is that because of the short turnaround of 4 to 5 years, often even though a government may say they're going to do X in their term of office, they've then got re-election coming shortly afterwards, and the expansive nature of an environmental issue that may take 10, 15, 20 years to see through the whole process, maybe even longer, means that it's something they can't do in a governmental term. So often then another government will come in and then change that edict, and it will then move away and not be concluded. So environmental impacts are something that's very difficult to go through the political system because of the way it's set in place. We also have the fact that it's a global issue, and because it's a global issue, we can't do it locally. So you have to have countries around the world, including individuals and companies in the private sector, who then make sure that things change. And it's very difficult to get everyone to join up. If we look at the Paris Accord, the fact that Trump has chosen to drop out of the Paris Accord, which is absolutely ridiculous. He is looking at the fact that he's doing a short-term gain because he's saving money and he's able to do whatever he wants in a negative way to the environment in America. So he's not worried about fossil fuels. He can be backed by fossil fuel backers, etc., etc. That then puts him in a position that he's not being affected by the implication, or he doesn't believe he is, and he's making money for his country. The issue with that is a very short-term gain, which ultimately may cause us a real price and a real issue. What's interesting is that places like China and also the UK, in terms of our wind turbine technologies, we are becoming pioneers. The thing is that Trump is failing to see is that his legacy will be the fact that during his period, yes, okay, he maybe made some money for the American purse, but what will happen is that actually he's potentially putting the Americans way behind everyone else in terms of the adoption and also the use and the production of what ultimately should become the next wave of power sources. So if they're all stuck in fossil fuels, etc., and then China are producing high-end solar panels, wind turbines, etc., the people that everyone's going to go to and the leading economy will be China, which then makes you wonder what Trump's plan is. Although I think we all wonder what Trump's plan is, but ultimately, Trump has a very short-term goal, which is to make himself feel that he's done the right things in terms of making his country money, knowing fully well that he's probably not that long for the planet, which is probably not going to come too soon. So we've seen currently, in terms of our changes, we're seeing heightened weather patterns. So patterns that change from their norm. I've already talked about the fact that we're seeing some changes in the UK weather pattern. Over the past 2 decades, we've seen more hot weather here. We've also seen significant changes in the jet streams which funnel air around the planet. We have some real issues associated with that. Not only is it air systems that are at risk, we've also got the Atlantic conveyor, which is basically a warm water system that pulls water up from South America across the Atlantic and then comes around the UK. That gives us, for our latitude, unseasonably warm weather. So we're at the same latitude as Canada. Canada have huge amounts of snow and ice in the winter. They have similar summers to us, but they have very, very cold winters. They also have a drier environment than we do. We have more rain because of the fact we have this warmer weather coming in. The issue we have associated with that for us locally as England and the UK is the fact that if the Atlantic conveyor stops because of increased temperatures in sea, which melts sea ice, what happens is the Atlantic conveyor is powered by salinity, i.e. the amount of salt in the water. And scientists have looked at the fact that if the polar ice caps melt, the salinity will drop. That salinity drop may well then stop the Atlantic conveyor, which means that then our temperature change in the UK drops massively because we've no longer got this warm source of water coming in. What that then means is that we then pick up our standard latitude in terms of our planet, and we then pick up the same weather conditions as Canada. As we've already said, Canadians have very similar summer conditions to us, no issue. The problem we do have, though, is the winter conditions. We fail at even an inch and a half of snow, let alone 2 feet or 2 meters of snow. The problem also being that our buildings and infrastructure is not set up for that. Whereas a simple thing like the fact that where Canada have buildings which are designed to snow load, i.e. when it snows the roofs are of a certain pitch that snow falls off, or they are there to withstand a certain amount of snow in terms of its weight. UK buildings simply aren't. We have had no need to do so in the past, so even current buildings that we are currently making will not withstand that level of snow. So weather conditions are a major concern for us in terms of what could happen there. Other parts of the world are experiencing severe drought. So Africa at the moment are having severe drought on top of a pandemic, which could see some major issues and the resurgence of Ebola. We then have localised flooding. So the UK suffers from localised flooding. We had floods recently, which saw various parts of the Midlands and the North East and North West suffer dramatic floods. There's also the real risk of global sea rise. At the moment, it's rising steadily, but they reckon that certain parts of the world, and often these parts of the world are ports, places like London, New York, various other major capital cities around the globe, will suddenly just disappear underwater, which obviously will have a huge impact. The protection of those cities theoretically is possible, but the flood defence systems that would have to be in place and would need to be absolutely epic, and it would be a huge financial undertaking as much as anything. Talked about the fact that polar ice caps are melting. There's various issues associated with that. Firstly, is sea rise, most obviously, but also there's huge amounts of gases that are actually trapped within the ice. So as the ice melts, it releases methane. One of the issues with that is that then that is one of the greenhouse gases which holds warm air around the planet into the planet. So by the caps melting, that then produces more gas, which actually exacerbates and makes the issue worse. We also have major fire events. So Australia recently, around Christmas time, had a series of fire events where they had bushfires, which they had to try and contain, which threatened major suburbs and cities. Whilst they do have a fire season, it's something they have. This was one of the worst on record because the temperatures were just slightly higher than normal, and everything was slightly drier, and that then stoked winds and made things burn more quickly. We have things like coral bleaching. So when we change the temperature of something, it means that then species are unable to adapt and keep up. And whilst coral is able to live in a variety of different temperatures, by pushing it too far just means that it simply cannot keep up, and then the coral dies. There's species globally that are dying out daily from the fact that there is temperature changes they can't keep up with. So animals just dying from drought and also from change in temperature. And finally, failing crops. So failing crops are an issue, particularly in places that grow their crops locally. But fundamentally, if we go to the point where temperature changes too much, we run the risk of crops failing globally. And should that be the case, then we obviously then have issues with starvation, countries not being able to get the food they need, or a lower level, just a real change in our diets, and it might mean that we end up eating very samey, boring foods all the time because they're the only things that we can easily grow and then live on. So, if we have a 4-degree rise, that's 5 to 6 degrees on land, 8 degrees, we would see a rise in European heat waves. We'd also see 50 to 200 centimeters level sea rise, which we've already seen 20 centimeters already, but 2 meters of sea change will be a major issue to the point where the amount of water that we have on the planet dictates, and where it's sat between land masses may mean that it actually changes our gravitational field. What that might mean is that we obviously, the planet rotates on a certain axis. That axis may change. If that axis changes, it could be the thing that then means that we have even greater fluctuation in temperatures, etc., etc. We could end up with part of the planet that was completely inhospitable to life. We might also have something where we have other areas which are always flooding or wet. It could be very interesting, and obviously then we've got all the issues associated with the fact that as we talked about, snow loading on the buildings in this house. We've got the fact that we've got droughts in other parts of the world, and the fact that animals and crops don't necessarily can't work in different environments. If you change the environments by shifting the gravitational field, that could be epically impactful on the way we live. And also, once we start seeing these temperature rises, we then have a huge reduction in crop yields, which, given the fact that as a species we are expanding exponentially, you're then looking at a real issue in terms of feeding the globe. So, one of the other issues associated with sustainability is our overconsumption. The UK throws away £9.7 billion worth of unused food every year. That's actually come down slightly, but it's still a vast sum of money in terms of what we're doing. There was a quote in one of the journals that I was reading as I went through this, and I think that is actually the link on the right-hand side of the page. By 2050, human beings could devour an estimated 140 billion tonnes of materials, ores, fossil fuels and biomass per year, 3 times the current consumption rate. So at the moment, we are already wasteful. We are also over-consuming the planet. By 2050, we run the risk of doing 3 times as much unless we change the way we live and how we approach stuff. It could be very interesting to see what happens by 2050. We're also very wasteful for our energy. So while you're listening to this, have a think. Is your mobile phone charger plugged in? Why didn't you switch it off? It's a tiny little thing that we do. And what we do is we take our phone, unplug it, and then we can't be bothered to go. We just can't be bothered just to go. And in doing so, we actually then, the charger is still drawing power. It's a very, very small amount of power. New modern chargers are better than old chargers used to be. But it actually costs £57 million per annum just in the UK, just because we all leave our chargers on during the day without switching them off. That creates 250,000 tonnes of CO2 every single year just because people can't be bothered to go. So we have to question what we do as individual users. And although we have possibly a very minor input, when we all then gather together and everyone does the same thing and everyone is very lazy to do small minor changes, we then add together to make real issues for the planet. We also have things where we have a demand for technology. So overconsumption comes in a variety of forms. One is wasting stuff, 2 is buying more than we need, and 3 is then getting things or making demand for aspects that, or for products that we don't actually need. So for instance, a single smartphone creates about 57 kilograms of CO2 during its lifespan if it's used for 3 years. Obviously, if it's used for more, that equates to more waste. The issue with that is 57 kilograms of CO2 is a lot. If we change our phones routinely, particularly if they're not broken or they don't need to be changed, that then causes all sorts of issues with the fact that we're then creating all this extra CO2. Equally, we could talk about the extra CO2 that's caused by fashion, by buying consumer goods, all the rest of it that we as a country are used to doing, and something that we need to consider more carefully. What is it that we actually need to live our lives? Why do we buy more than we need? So if we look at mobile phones and smartphones generally, smartphones used to be, or mobile phones used to be, originally when I was a teenager, they were around for about 12 months, and then they moved to 18 months, and now we're moving to 24 months, which is a good thing. So they're expected to last longer. One of the issues we've got is something called Moore's Law. He was a he was a scientist in the 1950s, and he came up with a theory that said Moore's Law says that every 18 months, your technology moves and is twice as fast. So if you buy something, once it gets to be about 2 years old, it is significantly slower than the stuff that's already there. And that's been true ever since the 1950s, apart from a small dip where there was some issues with manufacture globally and a recession. But generally, that law has stayed in place and fits absolutely perfectly. So everything that's 2 years old is then 2 times slower than everything else. So we, as consumers, then demand that we want new things. So as designers go through their design phases, they start having to think about what impacts they have. So social, economic, and environmental decisions are ones which they need to consider. Okay, what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to just have a look at this list and pause the video for a moment. Think about what you think each of these statements mean. So pause the video now and then come back to it once you've, with it on a note piece of paper, which you'll need elsewhere in this. Write down what you think each of these statements mean and what do you think they impact on in terms of a mobile phone. Okay, so you should have gone through and had a look at this. So the first thing, we've obviously got issues with energy to make. So the energy to make it is the energy consumption from power stations or from resources where we can get power, such as solar, biomass, wind turbines, etc., etc. The energy that then goes into it is then in a variety of components, and it's not as simplistic as just being a single action. When you start having products which have numerous component parts, such as a mobile phone, numerous different technologies and materials, then the energy to come is in multi parts. It's not just a single, there is a set energy cost. It depends on how complicated the product is and the range of processes that it goes through. Energy to transport. Again, this isn't just the transport of the finished mobile phone, this is also the materials from across the globe. Quite often what happens are that materials are mined globally, so all across the globe. They're then brought to a single place of manufacture. They are then manufactured there. They are then shipped globally to wherever they are. So sometimes materials will start in one place, be shipped once, twice around the world, depending on where they're going, into the final product to then return as a mobile phone. So energy to transport goes obviously has a significant impact on sustainability overall. There's then pollution. So there's a number of different types of pollution. So pollution coming from the actual manufacture of the product, pollution coming from the transportation, pollution coming from what the mobile phone does. So there you have all sorts of issues where we're looking at pollution, noise pollution, people using their phones just in public spaces. Equally, it's then emissions, etc., etc. So heat and then other aspects which come from either the energy that's being put into the mobile phones or from other sources. Okay, the other issues that may be associated with things like habitats. So how when we mine the ore or when we build stuff or when we recycle or repurpose component parts, depending on how we go about it, what impact does that have on the local habitat? Biodiversity, we've discussed biodiversity already, but also then if the habitats are majorly impacted, then is that reducing the range of animals or microorganisms across the planet? Where we actually source our materials, do they come from reliable resources or do they just come sustainable resources or do they just come from a hole in the ground? We'll be talking a bit more about where we get materials from shortly. There are very sustainable ways of doing it. So for instance, in Australia, they have huge forests, and what they do is within those forests, they know that if they creep in from the side of the forest, then they will erode the forest and destroy the forest. Whereas what they actually do is they pick a large 10-acre site in the middle of the forest, they deforest it, they then mine the materials from underneath it. Australia is very rich in aluminium, so they quite often get the aluminium. What they then do is they then reseed, replant, and then leave that area. And then they drive somewhere a significant distance away and rinse and repeat and do the same thing. Because of the way they go about it, what happens is that the animals that were living within the area that's been mined get to move. Then, and they can move themselves because they haven't got to go very far. Then what happens is that over a period of time, then the area that was deforested then reforests itself because it's surrounded by forest. The forest then closes back in, and then it's a completely sustainable way of doing it. Other people have different methods. So, for instance, in Indonesia and also in places like Brazil, quite regularly the logging and the miners start at the side of the forest or the edge of the forest, and they just progressively move further and further in. the ground and the land is then given up to other things such as cattle grazing, etc., etc. So the forest can never regrow, and then you're putting more and more pressure on the animals to live in a smaller, or the existing animals to live in a smaller area, which then obviously directly affects what goes on there. Finally, fair trade. Fair trade is where we look at more social impacts, i.e., making sure that the farmers or the people that are either living on the land or producing the goods are being paid fairly, so they can have a decent quality of life as well. A good example of that is bananas. So it used to be in the 80s, 70s, 80s, banana pickers and banana growers were paid very, very little themselves, whereas the companies that exported them were paid quite a lot of money for the bananas because of the global requirement for them. That then impacted on the lives and the quality of life of the people there. Fair trade was then introduced, and you'll notice that most supermarkets now only stock fair trade bananas, i.e., the money that is paid fairly to the people doing the work. Obviously, the people that own the company still get paid more, but the people that are the farmers are paid enough to have a living wage and to actually be able to have a decent quality of life. Okay, I would now like you to pause the video again. And what I want you to do is, as a quick written discussion with yourself, or possibly with someone else if you've got someone else to chat with, discuss how the profit and costs may affect the choices made by manufacturers and how shareholders can influence ethical decisions. So how does the drive to make profit and costs affect some of the choices of the aspects we've just discussed? And also, who are shareholders, what do they want, and how do they influence ethical decisions? As always, with any of this, if you don't understand any of the language or there's any aspects which you haven't fully grasped, this is an opportunity for you to pause, get yourself on Google or something else, find yourself some information and fill in those gaps of knowledge. So you should pause the video now, write down a quick discussion of how the profits and costs may affect the choices made, and then come back to us. Okay, so on your piece of paper, what we want you to do now is we're looking at smartphones. One of the issues is we live in a society where we are very happy to just dispose of products when they become obsolete, or sometimes even if they are still perfectly viable, but we decide we don't want them anymore because fashion trends or we are keen to have a new product in our lives just for self-gratification. So what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to write 2 points. Answer the question. I think smartphones are good. Give us a good point. I think smartphones are bad, and give us a bad point. It might be that you end up with more than one or two. Have a think about what makes a smartphone good or bad. So pause the video and then come back. Okay, so you've had a bit of a think about what makes a smart video good or bad. Smartphone, sorry, good or bad. So some of the good points, maybe that an increased level of communication. What we've got is we've got the ability to communicate with others. We have the ability to search for information, so we can find information. We've also got all sorts of things which we didn't used to have. So we're able to record stuff through videos. We're able to have conversations with our friends face to face, which never used to happen. We have the ability to check weather patterns on the go. We have our own ways of storing information, looking at photographs. We also have all sorts of aspects where we can play games, we can be entertained. There's lots of positives about smartphones in terms of the way we live our lives. On the flip side, though, there's also negatives associated with it as well. One of the major issues with smartphones and our reliance on the technology is that as a society, we are becoming worse at communicating with each other verbally and in person routinely. And this is something for you guys to watch out for. As you walk through your college or school, have a look at the people around you and the number of people who are ostensibly friends, who are stood next to each other outside of a classroom waiting to go in, none of whom are talking to each other, all of whom are on their phone. The issue you've got there is the fact that nobody is actually communicating with each other or talking to each other. Recently, I went to a restaurant with my wife, and we were looking at, we were sat there having a chat, as we do, and we looked at a table next to us, and there were a group of 4 students, must have been in their early 20s. Every single one of them was on their own mobile device. none of them were talking to each other at all. And you have to then question why they were out in the first place. One of the issues we have is therefore people are actually getting worse at verbal communication. People are becoming more insular and doing things on their own. This may have a significant impact on society and may mean that we actually live our lives slightly differently. The other things with smartphones, obviously, that could be bad are our reliance on having new mobile phones, the fact that they feed us media in a certain way. So lots of us use various apps, um, Facebook's Facebook chat apps that do various things. There's end-to-end encryption that happens in things like WhatsApp, which allows things like terrorist units and people like that to actually communicate in an unbreakable encrypted form. There's lots of negatives that are associated with the capabilities of mobile phones, tracking, etc., etc. That allows people to track mobile phones. That's good if you've lost your mobile phone, but if someone is actually tracking where you are and what you're doing, is that what you want in terms of your privacy? And also at that point, real issues associated with privacy and also mental health as well, because of the fact that we have this single focus of what we're looking at. So when we look further into smartphones, lots of you will often have the latest phone in your pocket. Lots of you will also not really look after your phones particularly well. Probably several of you may well be watching this on a smashed screen phone. One of the things is because you break your phone, that's a fairly all right reason to buy a new phone. However, quite often we change our phones when we don't really need to. This is a photograph of a mine, believe it or not. So what we create a demand for mobile phones, as in we want the latest technology, or we break our phones because we're careless with it, and then we then create a demand by asking or going to a new provider or a shop and saying, right, I want to buy a new phone, the latest phone, whatever that might be. What that does is that increases demand for columbite tantalite, which I'll refer to as CT from here, and that's an essential material in the production of mobile phones. It's used within the aerial component of your mobile phone and allows you to get an increased signal and a better signal. So every single one of our mobile phones or smartphones has got that within it. Groups including militia from neighbouring countries fight to control CT supplies in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So a militia is basically an armed gang, for want of a better word, who normally have quite a bit of financial backing. Militia are basically, they rule through force and often will do all sorts of unspeakable things, from using machetes to chop people's hands off, to threaten them, to raping women, to killing parents and then indoctrinating children into their militia so that they believe the same things. Militia are not nice people. So the fact that there are militia fighting for control of CT supplies gives you an idea of what sort of serious impacts this might have. Land is cleared, so there's environmental issues to make the mining easier, which leads to destruction of habitats. Local population is forced off land, so if they're already there as a farmer, they might get forced off the land, so by the militia, they've got no choice. Issues associated with that are then the fact that if you are a farmer, not only are you not producing food for the local community, you don't have a job. Often then, because you don't have a job, you are forced either to join the militia or to go somewhere else or starve. So there's some real issues associated with pushing population off the land. So the farmers no longer have supplies of food or work. Gorillas, other animals, are eaten as bushmeat because there isn't the food supplies, or they just leave because their habitat has been destroyed and they've got nowhere to live. Money from CT then finances more militia in Uganda and Rwanda, as well as DRC. So you've got real conflict around the area. Because there's so much money, it increases the chance of conflict, decreases the chance of actual peaceful resolutions, which then in turn causes continued fighting in the DRC, Uganda, and Rwanda over this resource. Now, as a consumer, we don't often think about aspects in this level of detail. We don't consider what might happen from our choices to buy a new mobile phone. Unfortunately, there are some really severe impacts and things that as consumers we should be more aware of, and we should think more carefully about before we make decisions just to buy the latest technology on a whim. We should have a real need and desire. So it's not just smartphones, it's all sorts of different products. So the piece of work that my students are being asked to do is to create a resource around sustainability. They're looking at key aspects, including overview of environmental, social, and economic issues. This one's based on a window cleaner. Students in St Brendan's Sixth Form College will be working on a craft knife, one that we designed earlier in the year. There's a series of aspects within this example, which you can read at your leisure later on by pausing the video, that show details. My students have got access to the complete resource, which is on Moodle, so have a look there. But you'll notice that within this, what we're doing is we're showing the key issues, we're highlighting problems and suggesting possible solutions. Quite often, though, solutions are not possible. So more importantly, this is an opportunity for you to show your awareness of concerns and problems so that if they pop up in an exam, you are capable then of structuring your answer and talking about valid points in a context and environment of use, or in a global society about with sustainability at the core, and talking about that and how it might work or not. There are then a series of questions that are here to get you started. I'm not going to read through these questions. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring them up on the screen. Again, you can pause the video here and then have a look at these. We've got aspects where the social responsibility is then, does the product have an impact on people in a negative way in terms of their livelihoods, their skills, the way they live their lives, the amount of money they get paid, etc., etc. We've got environmental responsibility. So this covers a variety of things we've already covered within this video. Where do the materials come from? Do they cause pollution? Is there a way to design a product that doesn't do that? Does it use less energy? Does it use less materials? There's also aspects such as how much water is needed. Now, whilst that may not be directly applicable to the product you are designing currently, there are all sorts of issues associated with water. So for instance, if you've got a fabric component that has cotton is an incredibly water dependent product, plant, and as such you have to give it lots of water, and often that means that sources of water are streamed away from habitats, villages, and then they mean that crops fail and all sorts of impacts happen later on. So as much as anything, think about this as a wider issue as well, and try to start thinking about how the environmental issues might be impactful if you had slightly different materials within your design. And then we have economic responsibility. So what we're looking at here is then, is it, who's making the money out of it? Is it fair? Does the money get reinvested? Are we minimizing impacts through energy use? Are we making the right choices? Can people ultimately afford to buy it? Right, finally, we've got the 6 R's. So these are aspects that you may also consider. They are not necessarily in the resource that is on Moodle, but there's something else to send you down different routes. Reduce, reuse, repair, recycle, refuse, and rethink. So reducing the amount of material we do, the amount of energy, reusing component parts somewhere else again and again, allowing easy repair of the product or component parts to be replaced rather than having to throw the item away and buy a brand new one. Can bits be recycled? Can they be taken apart? So for instance, more complicated products often are very difficult to separate the different materials. As such, they have to be binned rather than actually recycled. Also, if we are recycling, are there the facilities to do so? So for instance, globally, we, as consumers, an example of recycling not necessarily being at its best, we recycle loads and loads of plastic bottles. We think we're doing a great thing as a consumer. We put them all in the recycling bins outside our homes, happy days. The issue we have then is what happens to those bottles afterwards. Routinely, there's so many plastic bottles that are created by us and then thrown away, or put into recycling, that they can't actually be recycled because there isn't the resources and the facilities to do so. In the past, whole container ships full of plastic then has been then shipped off to China by the UK, and then what happens? It's burnt. So we offset our responsibility and say, well, we dealt with it. We sent it to China, knowing fully well they were going to burn it, and then they burn it and pollute the atmosphere horribly with all the toxic fumes, benzenes, and all the rest of it that comes out of plastic. We then have refuse. So is it actually really necessary? Are all component parts of the product absolutely necessary? Do they need to do what they need to do? Are we buying something that's going to last for long enough? And then finally, rethink, is there a different way of doing it? Can things be done differently to allow us to reuse component parts or to do things in a different way? And it could be that maybe if you're doing your craft knife, maybe there's a way of adding in some sort of blade sharpener or blade protector or some way of allowing you to reuse your blades numerous times so that they are more efficient and they cut down on the waste. Finally, this aspects of this are based from a book called The Sustainability Handbook for Design and Technology Teachers. If you're a St Brendan student, you can go to the LRC and you'll find it on the code below. It's only a 2-day loan, so you'll need to make sure it goes back because other people need to do it. Importantly about this book, the book is aimed at technology teachers, as the title says, which is great. As A-level students, there's lots in it that is really suitable. As you go through it, though, be wary. There's quite a bit of stuff within it which is for setting lessons. As such, that is irrelevant to you guys, and you can skip over it, but there is a lot of useful information. Okay, I hope that that's been useful. Design Technology is a TV. I'd like to say thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.